Hello friends, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Carolyn. I have an honors degree in history, and so I thought it would be cool today to give you an idea of what my history degree looked like in a series of books. I will be sharing a little bit about each of these 8 books, but I'm also going to be talking about why they matter and why these 8 books kind of represent a comprehensive study in history. Each book brings something new to the table, sheds light on a different area of history, a different perspective of history, a different way of thinking about history, and that's why I've selected these 8 books. Now, the first book is one that simply cannot be missed if you're studying history, and that is Herodotus's Histories. This is arguably one of the first histories ever written. Herodotus is widely considered the father of history, and this is one of the first major works of historiography, which is the telling of history, the narratives of history. And it is excellent. It is jam-packed full of fun, interesting stories about the Greco-Persian Wars, about ancient cultures, about really interesting historical characters. This book is the major reason that we know so much about the ancient Greeks and the ancient Persians. It is one of the fundamental primary sources in terms of Western history. And so, of course, I read this book during my undergrad. So I think this is a really critical book to study during your undergrad because it introduces students to the concept of historiography and the challenges of interpreting and analyzing historical sources, especially ones this old. This text by Herodotus is thousands of years old. And while it is a history, some of it is borderline mythical. And so that's something that historians and students of history have to keep in mind when they're reading a book like this. How much of this is fact and how much of this is slightly fabricated based on Herodotus's religious presuppositions or the superstitions of the world in that time period. The second book I want to talk about is Destiny Disrupted, A History of the World Through Islamic Eyes by Tamim Ansary. This was, I think, the first history book that I read in my undergrad. Intro-level course. It was a broad survey course of world history, and this was my introduction to the Islamic world, and it completely shattered all of my presuppositions that I had about Islam and what Muslims believe and the way that Muslims view themselves in the world and what they believe their destiny in world history is. Since then, I've read this book again because I just loved it. It's entertaining, it reads like a novel, it's a page turner, but it's literally the early history of Islam. It talks about the Prophet, 4 rightly guided caliphs, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and so forth. And this was a really important book for me because in high school I only really learned Western history. And so this book presented an alternative perspective, looking at history through Muslim eyes, and also a very different perspective on the relations of the Western world to the Middle East. We in the West, we see things one way, and typically that kind of looks like them bad guys, religious fanatics, yada yada yada. Us good guys, we're liberal and progressive and democratic and so forth. And we have a very simple understanding of the history of the relationship between the West and the Middle East. We also have no idea what really drives the Middle East and Muslims in that part of the world, and what they're believing, what they're hoping for, how they're viewing the West, how they're viewing the rest of the world. Many of us in the West are ignorant of these things, and that's why I highly recommend this book. This book also encourages critical reflection on the narratives that we tell and are told about the Middle East. But again, it's a thrilling literary journey. You're going to see battles, you're going to go inside palaces, you're going to meet fascinating characters, and it's all around just a great read. It was a national bestseller, it was highly praised, and I can't say enough good things about this if you as a Westerner are hoping to expand your historical perspective and understand history from a viewpoint that you've never considered before. My next book is The Uses and Abuses of History by Margaret MacMillan. Margaret MacMillan is a famous Canadian historian, and in this book she examines how history is interpreted, used, and abused by academic historians, by popular historians, and by the general public. Even if you're not someone who studies history, you encounter history all the time. You do have some kind of understanding of history, and where is this understanding coming from? Who is telling you things about history, consciously or subconsciously? What are you learning from the media, from movies, from popular books? Is what you're learning about history accurate? And if not, who's responsible for giving you that inaccurate perspective? And how can you make your perspective more accurate? This book dives into all of those issues. Margaret MacMillan provides insights into the ethical obligations of historians and the importance of historical accuracy and integrity. History is a big deal, and historians, the ones who write history, who tell history, who are responsible for how people perceive history, That's an important calling. And for those of you looking to study history, as I have, we need to realize that what we write matters. We need to be careful about telling history as the victors, you know? This book is also very fun. It pokes fun at historical misconceptions and biased narratives that we often hear. And it's just very quirky and enjoyable. Popular level, it's quite accessible read. Overall, this book is important because it's critical, if you were studying history, that you know what you were doing and you know what the implications of your study and your writings are for academics and the general public alike. Next, we have this thick, chunky biography of Václav Havel. Václav Havel. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. There's a very high chance I'm not. This was one of the first books I read in my first year of my history undergrad, and I was not really prepared for a biography this in-depth. This was not an easy read by any means, especially coming in not knowing much about the specific details of Czech history. I mean, I knew a lot of things broadly about the Cold War era and what that looked like, and Soviet communist states and what life was like inside those states. But I did not know much about the history of Czechoslovakia and then the history of the Czech Republic and Slovakia after they were split. And so this book taught me a lot about an era, but it also taught me a lot about the importance of biography in history. Václav Havel was a playwright, he was an artist, and he was also a politician. He became the first president of the Czech Republic after the split. And so this book, like any good biography, it just chronicles his life and also his time. This is a really good case study of political activism, dissent, and non-violent revolution in Europe. If you're interested in the Cold War era stuff, if you're interested in different types of revolutions and how to have a revolution, then this is a good book for you. But overall, I really appreciated having to read this biography and write a paper on it. It really emphasized the importance of the lives of individuals in history. It is individuals who shape historical events and movements and patterns, and stuff doesn't just happen on its own. It's people behind everything. Next I have The Next Christendom by Philip Jenkins. So this book explores the changing demographics and dynamics of Christianity throughout the world. I mean, if you live in the West, you know that religion is very much being pushed into the private sphere and that levels of religious affiliation and participation are declining, but such is not the case in the rest of the world. In fact, Christianity is exploding in the global South, it's growing in China, in Asia and Africa in general. And we in the West often do not hear about those things. Many of us just view Christianity as an outdated, unpopular, on its way out the door religion, but that is not the case globally. If you take a global perspective, that's not what's happening. This book really helpfully challenges the Eurocentric view of Christianity. Well, it started in Israel and then really moved westward. Now it's moving eastward and southward, and that is really important to note. This book provides insights into the historical forces and cultural factors that drive the spread of religions and Christianity specifically, and it really encouraged me as a student to consider the implications of global religious trends for politics, society, and interfaith relations. For example, what does it mean that Christianity is growing in Africa, where tribal religions and Islam have been the prevalent religions for quite some time? Or what does it mean that Christianity is growing in the Middle East and in China? What are those interactions going to look like? Next up, I have The Vanishing Past by Trilby Kent. Don't even get me started on this one, guys. This book does so many things. It's short, but it is snappy. First of all, this book encourages students to consider the role in safeguarding their cultural heritage. This book laments the state of historical education in the Canadian public system, talks about how students are left with huge gaps in their historical knowledge and without a proper understanding of who they are, what Canada is, what it means to be Canadian, how they fit into the history of Canada, in the history of the Western world more broadly, and in the history of the globe even more broadly. My favorite thing about this book is that Trilby Kent argues that history is not just a subject, it is the subject. History affects every part of our world, and therefore a well-rounded understanding of history is critical for us to be able to function at our best in the present and to move with wisdom into the future. Trilby Kent recommends classical education as a replacement for the current Canadian system, and I have to heartily agree. I have been obsessed with classical education for a long time. I wasn't classically educated myself, but it's something that if I stay in education career-wise, I would love to work at a classical school where history is the focus and all subjects are brought back to history and the historical narrative is just drilled into the children so they understand how everything fits together. and I definitely want my future children to be classically educated. On the whole, as a history lover, I just fully agree with Kent that history deserves more recognition as a subject. It deserves more love. It deserves to be properly addressed and taken seriously as a subject. We need to acknowledge that history is the thread that brings every other subject together, and that history frames every other area of life. It frames our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. I mean, this is why I study history. It makes sense of everything. It tells me who I am, where I am, what's happened before me, what's happening around me, what could potentially happen in the future. It's the story of the world. It's the most important story there is, and we ought to know the story of the world. We ought to know our own history. We ought to know the guiding forces of history. We ought to know who's in charge of history. And though we can't fully comprehend the ultimate purpose of history, there is a purpose to history, and we ought to be interested in studying it and figuring it out. My 7th book is The Light Ages, The Surprising Story of Medieval Science by Seb Falk. This is one of those books that, again, just shatters all the preconceptions you have about a historical time period. Essentially, this book argues that the Middle Ages, also known as the Dark Ages, were not dark. In fact, they were light. They were the Light Ages. So Seb Falk just highlights some of the overlooked innovations in science, in technology, in philosophy that occurred during the Middle Ages that we don't talk about. So this book provides insights into the intellectual and cultural dynamics of the Middle Ages. It challenges the stereotypes with the Middle Ages. It offers a case study of technological innovation and knowledge transmission in pre-modern societies. This book encourages students to consider the continuity and change in scientific practice and thought over time. We didn't just get out of the medieval ages into the pre-modern era and bam, we knew a bunch more stuff and invented things out of the blue. No, like, there was a history behind that. There were innovations and developments and discoveries during the Middle Ages that allowed the scientific revolution to take off later on. So highly recommend this book if you're looking for a new perspective on the Middle Ages. And finally, I have the 2020 Commission Report on the North Korean Nuclear Attacks Against the United States by Jeffrey Lewis. Now, this is actually not a historical book. It is a speculative novel. It's an example of alternative history, if you will. And I read this book for a course on nuclear arms and disarmament. And basically, Jeffrey Lewis just imagines what would go down if North Korea actually decided to attack the United States with nuclear weapons. What would that look like? And so this book features Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. It's witty, it's entertaining, but it also just kind of makes your heart stop to think about how things could potentially go with the existence of nuclear arms. Thankfully, they haven't gone this way, and it's unlikely that they will, but it's still possible. This novel is speculative, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. Essentially, this is just a really good case study for understanding the complexities of international relations, nuclear proliferation, and conflict escalation. How do these things work? How do politics, technology, and geopolitics interact? How might they interact? What would happen if all the typical ways of negotiating went out the window because some crazy person was the leader of a country with nuclear weapons and didn't care about international law or norms or customs or the preservation of human life in general? Anyways, definitely a page turner, definitely one of the most unique reads of my history undergrad, but would highly recommend. So this was my history degree in 8 books. Now, of course, I read way more than 8 books in my undergrad, especially since I had 2 minors in English Lit and International Relations. Proportionally, both of those minors constituted more reading than my history major did because my history major was more lecture heavy and seminar heavy. We read a lot more articles and smaller pieces like that. But man, just looking at these books, flipping through them again, thinking about their arguments again, talking about them to you guys, just makes me miss studying history so bad. I haven't even been out of school for a full year yet, and I already miss it. Thankfully, I am still doing historical research for a professor on the side, so I still get to dip my fingers into historical research on a weekly basis. By way of a personal update again, I am thinking about going back to school and doing my master's in history. Logistically, I'm not sure how that would work yet. Financially, I'm not sure how that would work yet. My husband and I are talking about it. I'm in the process of applying. I don't know how many programs I'm going to apply to yet because there's one that I really have my heart set on because it would allow me to study long distance and part-time at my own pace and it's from a very credited university, especially for history. And so I'm really hoping that that one works out, but it may not. I may decide not to pursue a master's degree yet. I may not get accepted, who knows. But I am thinking about it because, as hopefully you could tell by this video, I am very passionate about history and about studying the story of the world and learning what the story of the world means for me personally and sharing with you guys what it means for you. And I think history just tells you so much about humanity and also about God, and can help answer some of those existential questions that we all think about from time to time. And studying history has been a huge blessing for me. It's really changed my life, and I have absolutely no regrets about spending 4 years reading these books and many, many others, and I almost wish I could do it all over again because I loved it that much. So if you're thinking about studying history, I highly recommend that you do. I can't stress the value of a liberal arts education, especially in history, enough. Do it. Just do it. Just study it. Even if it doesn't seem like the most practical thing, it might end up being the best thing for you. Learning is never wasted, but of course, if you're not into history, then study what you're passionate about. If your means don't allow you to study history, but you're interested in history, you can do so without going to school. You can find these books at the library or online. You can watch videos like this. There's so much available online to teach you about history as well, and I highly recommend doing that, going to sites like HistoryNet, World History Encyclopedia, etc., etc. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you've read any of these books or you're interested in reading any of these books, please comment and let me know down below. I love hearing from you guys. I love meeting and getting to know people with similar passions as me. So if you're a history student, or you have been a history student, or you're thinking about becoming a history student, or you're a history expert, I would love to hear from you and hear your story and why you care about history and what studying history looks like for you. So please let me know. I would really appreciate that. And as always, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you again in the next one.